Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. I'm not going to lie. Been a little bit of a rough morning here. Nothing too bad or anything like that, but some days sort of anything that can go wrong sort of does. Sort of feels like that's the case here, but the good news is we're ready to go, ready to have a great time for the show. I will tell you this for those of you watching live. For our R.S. Andrews cool down, our comments after the show, we're going to have to be very, very short with that today. We have a little bit of a thing we have to do here today, so that's going to take us away from the comments. I know we got started, obviously, for those of you who like the live comments before the show. We're obviously running a little late on that today. I apologize for that, but the good news is great show planned for you. It includes Jake Fromm here today live. Good to have him back in his Tuesday spot. Connor Riley, update on everything happening with Georgia's spring practice, so all of that is going to be really good. And to kick things off, something I think you're going to really like. There is a player right now for Georgia. I have a little bit of a suspicion that may turn out to be far better than anybody realized for this upcoming season. It sounds like his level of focus is one of the things that could help him get there. What do you say we start with that? Sounds like a lot of fun to me. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
If you think about one of the recipes for what makes a college football team exceptional in years when that takes place, it seems like oftentimes one of the things you have is players that we think might be good and are kind of to a somewhat degree known commodities. They end up being far better than you could have ever realized, or maybe far better than they would have been predicted to be at the very beginning of that season. Here at Georgia, we have, I think, a perfect example of that. I spent some time this morning kind of going back down memory lane on stuff like this, that obviously the 2021 Georgia Bulldogs, national champions, they also had a defense that'll be remembered among the very best in college football history. But it's really interesting to kind of go back to the season, or I should say the time before that season began. And one of the things you discover is there wasn't a whole lot of like recognition or predictions of just how good Georgia was going to turn out to be. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. You know, Pro Football Focus will do its kind of rankings before the year begins of the top 10 returning quarterbacks or top 10 returning wide receivers. Well, in, kind of like early 2021, prior to that season beginning, when they ranked their top 10 returning defensive linemen for the 2021 season, now keep in mind, the thing that propelled Georgia more than anything in 2021, it's great defense, but primarily it's great defensive line. You know, Jordan Davis won like the Lombardi Trophy and the Bednarik Award. Trayvon Walker became the number 1 overall pick. Devontae Wyatt was also a first-round pick. Jalen Carter, for what it's worth, was a backup on that team. But no one seemed to really appreciate just what a commodity those players would prove to be for Georgia. In fact, when Pro Football Focus ranked its top 10 returning defensive linemen for the 2021 season, the names mentioned: Nick Bonito from Oklahoma, Kayvon Thibodeau from Oregon, obviously a good player, DeMarvin Leal from Texas A&M, Aiden Hutchins from Michigan, once again also a good player, Majai Sanders from Cincinnati, Will Anderson from Alabama, good player, no dispute there, Haskell Garrett from Ohio State, Zion Tupelo Fatal from Washington, Demetrius Taylor from Appalachian State even got a mention, Tyreek Smith from Ohio State got a mention, but no mention of Walker, no mention of Davis, no mention of Wyatt. Conversely, later on that summer, when the SEC put out its preseason All-SEC team, when the media at SEC Media Days voted on that, you know, Jordan Davis did get a first-team preseason nod, so that there was at least some recognition of our regional media for how good Davis would prove to be. But Trayvon Walker, the eventual number 1 overall pick, was just third-team All-SEC to begin the season, and Devontae Wyatt wasn't mentioned at all. The point I'm getting to here is that in a season in which Wyatt and Davis and Walker and that great Georgia defensive line became really kind of an engine that propelled Georgia towards a national championship, there weren't a whole lot of people predicting that to happen prior to before the season began. So that's context, I think, that's pretty important for us as we look to this season for Georgia right now. If Georgia is to sort of once again be in the mix for a championship, it is very likely that some of the players that are potentially leading Georgia in that direction also won't have, necessarily a whole lot of fanfare ahead of the upcoming season. The guys that may truly emerge for Georgia in 2025 may not necessarily be predicted to do so in the preseason, and we have strong examples of that, like the ones I just cited. So let me give you an example of a player I have on my mind when it comes to that here right now. And this is a very weird comparison. I think I'm probably the only one to ever make this particular comparison. But much like guys like Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt, Trayvon Walker kind of came not quite from out of nowhere, but certainly with very little fanfare on their way to great seasons and, unprecedented success for a defense and a national championship for Georgia. I think there's a chance that a guy like Oscar Delp could be able to travel a similar path for the Georgia offense this season. And the genesis of all of this in my mind was the other day I saw this year's version of Pro Football Focus's like top 10 returning tight ends, and Oscar Delp wasn't on that list either. And look, it could very well be there's just sort of a bumper crop of tight ends here in college football in 2025, or this could be on the basis that, and we'll get more into this in a moment, that Delp didn't necessarily have a great year for Georgia in 2024. He played very well towards the end of the season, we would say, but probably not a great year overall, that it's not necessarily an egregious oversight not to have Oscar Delp as your top 10 returning tight ends for this upcoming season. We're not mad about this, but it is interesting, and at least in one respect, it sort of rhymes with, some of what we saw in 2021 when Trayvon Walker and Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt were also overlooked prior to what turned out to be very big seasons for them. Now, when you think about Delp, he is also one of the guys that last week I thought gave, and we had, actually a week ago, we'll hear from some more Georgia players today, but a week ago, we heard from 7 different Georgia players. What we said was, over the course of time, we're going to be hearing from more and more, kind of unpacking more and more of what was said, because there was so much that came out of that last Tuesday. You can't quite all do that in one day. And so we said, hey, we're going to take some time and listen to a lot of these players. And one of the things you're going to, I think, see is kind of a sort of a through line and sort of a narrative thread that connects all those player interviews that we heard from Georgia spring practice a week ago, was how remarkably honest they were, how incredibly just sort of forthright and just really willing to be introspective and sort of speak from the heart and kind of get to the heart of the issue when it comes to what Georgia needs to be here in 2025. Well, certainly a great example of that is what we heard from Oscar Delp last week. In particular, there's this. There was this notion that if you want to go into the 2024 season, I think a guy like Oscar perhaps thought, with a quarterback like Carson Beck and what everything was expected for Georgia, that perhaps he was on his way for like sort of one final ride through college football and on his way to the NFL. But ultimately, Delp, prior to this season, made the decision to return back to Georgia here in 2025. And speaking to reporters this time a week ago, he kind of explained exactly why it was that he wanted to return here to Georgia.
I don't want to live with regret, just leaving too much on the table. I just think, I know what kind of player I am, what kind of season I can have, and I'm just, ready to do that with the guys in this locker room and the guys in this team, living with Gunner, Cole, and Drew, and some of those guys. It's hard to kind of leave them early, just talking to my family, like all the coaches, everything, I just think is the best decision for me and everything.
This kind of goes back to what we also talked to Oscar about back in New Orleans prior to the Sugar Bowl, that it seemed like Oscar kind of got some new life in him just a little bit when Gunner Stockton became the quarterback, and I don't mean that as a slight against Carson Beck or anything like that, but it sounds like he and Gunner and I guess Drew Bobo and perhaps Cole Spear, kind of living with each other and having that camaraderie with each other. It sounds like there's perhaps sort of a new spark here among this Georgia team that at least from the perspective of Oscar Delp, that hasn't always been there. And once again, if you kind of want to make that comparison to 2021, that's also, I think, another commonality that they had was, if you listen to players during spring practice and things like that, and it's so important to understand the history and the timeline on this, that before we knew that Georgia was going to be a 2021 national champion, what we sort of saw that year as is the year coming off of COVID, the first year back after COVID, when players were intentionally kept separate. You weren't having the same practice routine. And I think anybody who kind of lived through that at Georgia would have said, I'm not really quite so sure how well I know my teammates. I'm not really quite so sure what kind of bond we have together, because there was almost a firewall put between the players for what was at the time thought to be about player safety, perhaps now sort of seen from a different angle. But nonetheless, there just wasn't a lot of necessary camaraderie existing when it comes to that 2020 Georgia team. So in 2021, a lot of steps were taken to kind of rebuild that. Georgia started doing those skull sessions, and players were getting together. They were standing up before the team. They were speaking about their quote-unquote why it is they like to play football. And along the way to what turned out to be a national championship season were players who grew to know each other just a little bit better and grew to perhaps trust each other a little bit better, to connect with each other a little bit more deeply. And pretty much anybody who played on the 2021 Georgia team would have said, yeah, that connection we had with each other ended up being really valuable. This wasn't just coach speak. This wasn't just something that sounded good. This really was very meaningful for that portion of those players' football journeys. And you can't help but think about that when Oscar's like, hey, I'm having a good time right now. I'm friends with the guys that I'm playing with. We have a tight bond with each other. Why wouldn't I want to come back and do as much of that as I possibly can and be the kind of leader this team needs me to be? Which also gets to another very interesting statement here from Oscar Delp on the subject of being a leader, and now not learning from a guy like Brock Bowers, but now being the sort of kind of more veteran player in that tight end room with some really good young tight ends. Whether you think about Jaden Riddell or Heinrich and some of the guys that have been there, the incoming freshmen like Ethan Barbour and obviously Elias Williams. There's a lot of good-looking young tight ends in the Georgia roster. In fact, one of the things that Connor Riley wrote in a practice report the other day is if you're standing out there watching practice for a couple of minutes, and if you just sort of look around, the tight end group may kind of look the best to your eyes of anybody. Well, a lot of those young, tight ends who are, good-looking athletes, they're looking to Oscar Delp for leadership. And last week when Delp spoke to the media, he was asked directly about kind of fully fulfilling that leadership role in what will now be his final year here at Georgia. And we got a very honest, very interesting, quite introspective answer from Oscar Delp on all of that. Let's take a listen to this.
Yeah, I mean, I just got to, last year there was times I feel like I had one foot out the door and I was just thinking about things I should have been thinking about. And it just kind of hurt me in ways that, I didn't think would happen. And then I kind of figured it out later on in the year how to really practice and how I should really be leading that room and everything. And I think with a full year of doing that, how I approached that and with just, trusting in Coach Hartley and all the coaches and everything that we've kind of had a plan on and came together, I think it's going to be a good season.
I really like Oscar Delp a lot, and I love answers like that from him. And what this is not meant to be right now is, do you know the joke, the meme that exists for Tennessee fans of, it feels like 98. Every year since 1998 for that Morebound program has in the minds of some fans felt like 98. All of a sudden they're going to get back their glory years. They're going to relive the national championship. If you're online, you sort of participate in college football, social media banter. You're probably familiar with the feels like 1998 Tennessee meme. I'm not trying to tell you that, hey, this is a feels like 21 type thing for Georgia. That's not what I'm not trying to oversell this or make this more than it is. But this particular aspect of this particular player does remind me of some of the stuff we would have heard about some completely different players at a completely different position back in 2021. When Delp says, honestly, I sort of had one foot out the door. I mean, I think if you're Devontae White or Jordan Davis, guys who knew they had, because of their body style and things like that, maybe Trayvon Walker too, they knew they had NFL futures. Maybe in 2020 when things weren't going great, when, pandemic, the world's weird, Georgia's not competing for a national championship, maybe those guys sort of felt like they had one foot out the door. And yet somehow they decided, my NFL draft fortunes might be bettered by one more go in college. And all of a sudden they came back, they got locked in, and lo and behold, they were way better than the Pro Football Focuses and many of the SEC preseason voters, and a lot of those folks would have thought they might be. It ended up being kind of a total surprise. Well, doesn't the Oscar Delp thing sort of feel the same way here a little bit, where last year he's thinking he's about to go to the NFL and he's sort of biding his time? The season played out the way that it did. Now perhaps returning back to college makes the most sense, but it's a chance to play with friends. His roommate is the starting quarterback, and all of a sudden, when you listen to Delp speak there, boy, it's almost like you get sort of a renewed sense of energy, sort of a renewed sense of focus. And I do believe that's, creates a possibility where coming into this upcoming season, there may be people who cover the sport, whether it be SEC media or national folks like the Pro Football Focus types. They may have no idea of the potential that does exist for Delp. And I do believe that potential is there. For a guy like Gunnar Stockton who's going to look around, who's going to need to try to find some stuff that's easy. Where do my easy yards come from? Where are my, guaranteed completions going to come from? When I really need to kind of get something to somebody because I got pass pressure coming on me, or we're just sort of in a bind on third down, I do believe that Delp could become that guy. And as we speak about, we're going to do more of this here in a moment, as we speak about all the ways in which the Georgia offense needs to and can improve in 2025, finding dependable playmakers is a big part of that. And I don't think anybody realizes just how much talent and potential exists within Delp. But much like in the past, Georgia sort of surprised before by unleashing some very talented players on their way to excellent seasons that weren't necessarily projected for that before the year began. Oscar Delp on the offensive side of the ball could be that version here in 2025. And if it plays out that way, that's obviously very good news for these Dogs. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We're really glad to have you with us. However you get to us here today, live on video, that's 10 a.m., radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, wherever you find them, all kinds of fun stuff going on here today. And we're glad that you're with us for it. Spring practice rolling on. We got a commitment date for Jared Curtis yesterday. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. So it is just a jam-packed show, and all of it made possible by our friends at ServPro. Now, you know this about ServPro. When it comes to fire damage, water intrusion, things like that, ServPro is all about making sure that your property gets restored to its previous condition. That's why the folks that work there, the folks that dedicate their life to this level of service, they're called restoration specialists. For your mess, whatever it's caused by, they can put it back together, get it cleaned up, get it fixed back up, and have it to your eyes like it never even happened. Because in a situation where you find a big, giant mess, that's what you want. And that's what ServPro is all about. Every franchise also independently owned and operated. They're dealing with people who have kind of dedicated their life to this level of service for you. So fire breaks out, water pipe bursts, something like that. Our friends at ServPro want to be there for you. You can find them online, servpro.com, for more on that. Also, don't forget, coming up this Friday, big night with ServPro as they celebrate our first responders with the Athens Rock Lobsters. Big night coming up on that. I'm looking forward to being there. My son's coming with me on that. I've heard from some of you. You're planning on being there as well. So if you just, go check out the special events tab with our friends at the Athens Rock Lobsters, you can get your discounted tickets for that. Don't forget, out front, the big mobile command center from ServPro going to be on site there, hanging out, having a good time, really enjoying ourselves. If you're going to be planning on being there, please make sure you say hello to me. I'd love to be able to say hello to you. ServPro, good people. They love supporting the community. They love the fact we've got professional sports now in Athens when it comes to the Athens Rock Lobster. So we're getting ready for a big night on all of that coming up this Friday. Cannot wait to see you there for that. Speaking of big show for us, it's Jake Fromm later on. It is Connor Riley here coming up in just a couple of minutes. But prior to that, let's get ready to go around the doghouse. Now, I just talked a moment ago about, hey, Oscar Delp could be a playmaker ready to emerge for Georgia. People may not quite realize just how good he has the potential to be. Some of that because it wasn't necessarily a great season for him a year ago, but let's also give proper context here. That if it wasn't a great season for Delp, some of that is also true because in the eyes of plenty, including some Georgia fans, as you know, well-traveled turf here, it wasn't a great year for the Georgia offense overall. And I could not help but notice the other day, ESPN does these little blurb write-ups on the various teams, and I like stuff like that. I think the preseason content's always kind of fun. So they were looking at a handful of teams about, college football playoff hopefuls, but like the one thing that might prevent you from making the college football playoff. And Georgia was mentioned in this particular story. It is perhaps not a surprise to you, nor should it be, that the one thing that was mentioned is if Georgia somehow shockingly doesn't make the college football playoff, the likely culprit as to why that might be is because of some offensive concerns that just don't get cleaned up, some offensive issues that just don't quite get fixed. If Georgia somehow has a really disappointing season, this will trace back to some of those offensive issues. Once again, you already know that. Our comment sections reflect that. Social media reflects that. Georgia fans have been having that conversation for quite some time. And the interesting addendum to all that is Kirby Smart's, at times, unwillingness to play into that narrative. Let's go back in time a couple of weeks when Georgia's spring practice was just beginning. Smart asked directly, because of all the sort of hot topics around his offensive coordinator Mike Bobo, his offensive line coach Stacey Searles, for the offensive issues that ESPN says that it noticed. You know, the criticism there and what Smart's response to that was, and Smart made it very clear going back a couple of weeks ago, he doesn't agree with any of that at all. He was quite pleased with the job his staff did a year ago. In fact, saying he thinks they're better than anybody. This is what Smart said just a couple of weeks ago.
To be honest with you, I don't get into it much. I worked in a place for 10 years before I came here, and it's my 10th spring, so that's 20 years that, you know, I really don't pay much attention to anything outside. I got a lot of confidence in this organization, the foundation we've built. I've got the best staff in the country, and I have no doubt about that. I've got one of the most experienced SEC staffs there is, and to be honest with you, there's a lot of confidence in that, and I have a lot of confidence in it.
One of the things I think is interesting about Kirby Smart is I think Smart, to a degree, sort of understands power dynamics a little bit, that, you know, in a position of power, there's only so much that some people are going to be willing to acknowledge. And, you know, even in answering that question, Smart doesn't really give the soundbite that travels and becomes sort of national news of, you know, people think our offense is bad. You know, like he doesn't say those words out loud. He hears the question, doesn't really restate the premise of the question in his answer. He just says, I think I got the best staff there is. You know, that's a very controlled answer that doesn't really further the narrative of your offense struggled, your coaches are being blamed. You know, Smart's answer is sort of self-contained without really granting any of that premise, sort of understands all of that. And a little bit of the same kind of thing in the clip we played for yesterday. Smart was on with the college football personality you may know, Josh Pate. And once again, the same type of deal comes up of, hey, you know, people are saying all this stuff after 2024, but this time, not only does he say, you know, obviously furthering the idea that he's got the best coaching staff in America, he thinks he and his coaching staff, as you know, Smart saying in the clip we played for yesterday, did their best coaching job ever in 2024. Once again, here's an example of that from Kirby Smart. This is a clip we played yesterday.
Coaching job we've done by far, 100%. We were not as good as some of the years previous, and we had twice the schedule some of the years previous. So to the naysayers, to the onlookers, to the people that don't know, I respect everybody's opinion. You can have an opinion, you can do what you want with it. I know football, and I know the level of schedule we had to play, and I know the roster we did it with, and I know the injuries we had. By far and away, the best job that our staff and our organization has done, easily.
The reason why I play that clip for you again is because I think some Georgia fans probably wish that Smart would more openly acknowledge what some of them say they've seen, offensive struggles, what ESPN says that it's seen, and Smart only to a small degree is willing to kind of give that voice. At the very end of that clip, he does say, hey, there's a lot of things statistically we need to be better at, but the larger message is best coaching staff in America, doing its best job ever in 2024. That's just sort of the way that Kirby Smart talks. But sometimes it's more important to pay attention to actions than it is words. Words are sometimes just a thing to fill the 20 minutes worth of a press conference or the interview that you've agreed to do. But the actual actions oftentimes speak far louder. Perhaps we have an example of that right now. You may have seen this from Matt Zenitz. He's a reporter for 24/7 Sports. Zenitz writing on the X platform yesterday that Georgia is targeting Phil Rauscher and John Lilly for roles on its staff. Rauscher was the Jacksonville Jaguars offensive line coach the last 3 years. Lilly, a 30-year coaching vet, has been a tight ends coach in both college and the NFL, and he was obviously Georgia's tight ends coach from 2008 through 2015. So the point we're getting to is this. Kirby Smart tells the contingent of Georgia media a couple of weeks ago, our coaching staff is the best in America. Tells Josh Pate this week, our coaching staff did its best job ever in 2024. And I'm certainly, perhaps, Kirby Smart believes all of that. But the actions also speak to the idea that even if I was pleased with how we performed, given the unprecedentedly difficult schedule we played, there is still room for improvement. Smart doesn't speak openly and very loudly about all of that. He doesn't echo the social media narrative, the message board narrative, the talk show narrative. But his actions do, I think, suggest here, by bringing in a vet like Rauscher, by bringing in a trusted former UGA staffer like Lilly, who I think people have fond memories of. By bringing these guys in, to me, it's an indication that while Kirby Smart was pleased with how Georgia performed compared to the schedule that it played, there is still room for improvement on that, and there'll be work being done during this offseason to make sure that happens, especially in the case of Rauscher when it comes to the offensive line, because for a lot of people, that kind of points back to Georgia's key struggle a year ago. I think if you're a Georgia fan, you take some comfort in this. Neither Rauscher or Lilly are going to be huge additions to the support staff here at Georgia. That's not a major bold print headline, but sometimes it's the smallest things that make the biggest difference. And sometimes it's the quiet commitment to improvement, no matter what you say publicly, that has the chance to pay the biggest dividends. Kirby Smart's not going to play along with the narrative very much of the offense needs to get better and it being a potential stumbling block for playoff success here for Georgia. But privately, it seems like they're working to show that improvement and develop that improvement, and perhaps adding a couple of names to the support staff, an example of that. And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. Now, we got great guests here coming up. It is Jake Fromm back on a Tuesday before we're done. But for now, on everything else going on here around Georgia, let's talk to Connor Riley here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let's say hello to Connor Riley. Glad to have him here today as part of DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. Connor, let me bring you in on what we were just discussing. Matt Zennett's good reporter, guy who usually has pretty strong information, letting us know that Georgia perhaps bringing back a staffer that we know, John Lilly. Rauscher, I guess, a guy I'm not, to be honest with you, quite as familiar with, but it sounds like he's got a long tenure in the NFL. And this to me sort of seems like the kind of quiet moves that actually have the chance to sort of pay big dividends, as Georgia has leaned on its support staff in the past to get as much as it can out of its on-field performance. Bringing in vets, like guys with like multi-decades of experience, sort of speaks to, I think, quietly, Georgia's need for some offensive improvement and its willingness to kind of behind the scenes do as much as it can to boost that. What's your make here and take on what Zenitz appears to be reporting?
I disagree with that assumption there, that these moves have the potential to have a significant impact. Kirby said it after the Texas game. He said it in the clip that you played that he did with Josh Pate. Georgia just wasn't a talented enough team a season ago. And I know everyone wants to talk about the coaching staff and they want to talk about all the X's and O's that come with that and the decisions and the conservative run calls and the bubble screens and everything that comes with that. Kirby, I choose to believe, and because we saw it with our own eyes, this team was not as good as they were in years past. It was a talent issue a season ago. They've gone out at the wide receiver position and I believe legitimately fixed some of the issues there. And obviously they need those guys to go on the field and produce, but they've done just about everything they can from a talent perspective at the wide receiver position to go and address some of those concerns. And I think if you're able to do that and you're able to see better production from the wide receivers in this offense, that's going to open things up in the run game. Now, the offensive line obviously has to play better. I found it very interesting. A week ago, Monroe Freeling came out and I think really maybe underlined some of the concerns that last year's teams had, specifically on the offensive line. You had guys that were older and more established and maybe weren't always 100% focused and locked in on technique. Yes, they had injuries there a season ago, but they were so worried about maybe making mistakes. And I think that comes when your offense sort of sputters a little bit. You had the early season struggle against Kentucky, the poor first half against Clemson. And that sort of gets in your head where you're thinking, okay, I can't make this mistake, rather than I'm just going to go out there and do the best job to my ability there. So, Kirby can add these support staffers, Phil Rauscher, John Lilly there. But at the end of the day, and I think Kirby believes this too, it comes down to a talent issue. And Georgia just was not talented enough in 2024 to win a national championship. I think that played out even had Carson Beck not gotten hurt in the SEC championship game. So I'll be interested in seeing, what kind of impact these coaching hires does have. But whether or not Georgia wins a national championship, in my mind, doesn't come down to whether or not support staffers come in or coaching changes get made, but rather the overall talent level that Georgia has on this roster.
I wouldn't dispute that, but in the offensive line in particular, my assumption is that there was more talent present than the actual collective performance would have suggested. And I think the upcoming NFL draft is going to be an example of that, where, certainly Fairchild and Wilson and Ratledge, these are going to be pretty high draft picks for their position, and yet somehow it just didn't add up to everything that it could have. So when I hear kind of multi-year NFL offensive line coach kind of coming in to provide support, I take that as pretty good news.
I think with the offensive line, look, Georgia's tackles weren't good last year, and part of that is because Ernest Green, I think, was hurt in the later part of the season. Xavier Truss sort of was what he was for Georgia, and I think you can look back in 2023. When that offensive line was healthy, Xavier Truss was not a starting offensive tackle for that team. So I think going into this year, the couple of things that I look at here are, one, can they get better tackle play? Because, I believe that Monroe Freeling and Ernest Green have the tools to go out and be impact-level tackles. Do they do that? It remains to be seen. I think health played a big factor in them not doing that a season ago. We know Ernest Green was hurt later in the season, and then Monroe Freeling was pretty clearly banged up in that Notre Dame game and ultimately has labrum surgery in the offseason after that. But you've got to develop guys like Bo Hughley behind them. Juan Gaston, we've heard really good things about to this point. The other thing I want to touch on here, and I don't want to knock Jared Wilson in this sense, because he's going to be a high draft pick. I think he's going to go in the second round, might be one of the first centers off the board. But he had never started at that position, and he was never really, in my opinion, fully comfortable with all that was asked from that position. He's got all the athletic gifts that you'd want from an interior offensive lineman, but I think the mental side of things, and we know this because there were complaints in the games against Kentucky on the road, where I think he never fully got settled and looked pretty replacing a multi-year starter in Cedric Van Granger. I don't think Drew Bobo is a better athlete than Jared Wilson is, but I do think that there's a world where he's a better center than Jared Wilson was a season ago. And I think that communication is going to very much help this offensive line, because it is, as you point out, a younger, probably on paper, less talented offensive line than we saw a year ago. But, sometimes it's not always talent when it comes to the offensive line. It's, can you get five guys to play together and play coherently? And I think a season ago, Georgia's offensive line very much struggled to do that. And we never found the best five-man combination on Georgia's offensive line last year.
I think that's interesting. We got news yesterday that Jared Curtis is now going to announce his commitment on May the 5th. I think this recruitment has been interesting in that, clearly Curtis is trying to decide if Georgia's the right place for him. And obviously I think that Georgia has made Curtis a priority for now. But the sense that I get is much like Curtis is approaching this as a business decision of, hey, who's going to offer me the best compensation? What's going to be the best overall situation for me? The sense that I get is Georgia is also evaluating Curtis pretty aggressively here too. This is not the old school thing of, oh man, we want you so bad, and we're gonna just sort of, basically do whatever we can do to get you. This is also a thing of, hey, does Georgia really want to hitch its wagon to this guy for the next 3 to 4 years and kind of bring him into what I think will be a pretty robust competition with a guy like, say, Ryan Puglisi in the future? It seems like both sides are evaluating this in what I would describe as a pretty business-like manner, just based on people who kind of know more about this than I do. Feels like a very modern recruitment to me, in other words. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, and I'm interested in seeing moving forward what Georgia does in the event that they don't land Curtis. And I don't believe a decision has been made yet. I'm going to be very interested to see if he gets out to Georgia's spring game and Oregon's spring game. It wouldn't surprise me if he visits both those programs again before that May 5th decision. But at this point, I'm curious from Curtis's perspective of what there is to still learn and what there is to still see. Certainly from Georgia's perspective, because he was a one-time commit here, and you've seen so much of this program, even through all the turmoil of this past year, it still knows what this program is. So I think with Curtis, look, he is not, when you hear five-star quarterback and number one overall player at that position, you think, oh, this might be a guy that can come in and help you right away. I don't think he's that sort of five-star quarterback. I think he's going to be a guy that it's going to take him some time. And whether that's 1 year or 2 years, like, look, everyone fell in love with Arch Manning, but I think we'd all recognize that even as some have hyped him up to be, it's probably best for his development that he sat for those 2 years. And yes, he made some plays for Texas a year ago, but he was never, in my opinion, ready to be the starter. Otherwise, I think Steve Sarkisian would have made him the starting quarterback last year. So I wouldn't be surprised if Curtis follows a similar development there. And, so much of this depends on how things turn out with Gunnar Stockton and obviously a battle with Ryan Puglisi. But Curtis is not this, Caleb Williams, Trevor Lawrence type quarterback that can come in day one, play for you, make a difference, and lead and elevate your program. He's going to be a guy that, I think in part because of the competition that he plays against, is going to take a little bit of time there. And so when you factor in what you might have to be paying him from both an NIL perspective and also a revenue sharing perspective, it's going to be very interesting to see how Georgia goes about building out its roster, because as much as we sit here and talk about Jared Curtis and how many headlines he tracked, I think you and I both agree that if we could pick between the number one quarterback in this cycle in Jared Curtis and the number one offensive tackle in this cycle in Jackson Cantwell, I think we choose the latter of, okay, Georgia's going to spend big and open up that war chest and outspend a Miami, a Michigan, a Missouri that's got very favorable NIL laws. We prefer it to be the latter rather than a quarterback in Jared Curtis, who, again, and I'm not saying Cantwell is going to be a guy that steps on and plays day one, but we've seen with Georgia what they can do with those offensive line prospects in the past. At quarterback, when Georgia's won, it hasn't been because of a super toolsy player. It's been because of guys who have sat and developed and grown over the courses of their careers.
I think that's right. Obviously, we're going to hear from Kirby Smart again today. Spring practice rolling on. To be completely honest, we've done a lot of the Marcus Easley stuff the last couple of days. So if you don't mind, I want to push past that for a moment. That'll obviously be a big topic when Kirby speaks later on today. Give me your thoughts on what else has been kind of going on at Georgia spring practice over the course of the last week.
I'm interested in, and I know he touched on this a little bit last time, but how some of these second-year players are elevating and performing. Because, you hear him talk so much about how, we don't have a lot of guys who've been through 3 spring practices, and we have so many new players, 30 in total, going through spring practice for the first time this year. But there are guys like Ellis Robinson, DeMello Jones, Justin Williams. Obviously, Chris Cole is someone who I think a lot of people are excited in. Daniel Calhoun. Guys who redshirted a season ago and didn't see a lot of playing time. And I think that sophomore 2024 signing class is such a key for this team and how they develop. They only had, of the 28 signees, only 7 did not redshirt last year, meaning that those guys were playing in just about every game and making contributions there. You didn't lose anyone so far to the transfer portal from that class. Now, we'll see what happens with Nitro Togo and Marquise Easley following their suspensions and the way things go there. But I think it's these second-year players, the guys who so many of them redshirted a season ago. How are they now, as we approach about the halfway point in spring practice, how are those guys developing and how are they contributing to this team? Because those are going to be the guys that I think next year really play a big impact for this Georgia program. And that's something where, and it's part of the reason why I think Kirby came down so hard on this year's freshman class the last time we got a chance to hear from him. They know that going forward, they're going to need freshmen to come in and play even more, especially with how well they're recruiting and how much they're spending on recruiting. So I think that going forward, this idea where 3/4 of your class is going to sit in redshirt a year, you might be able to do that at some positions, like, say, the offensive line, maybe quarterback come to mind there, defensive line too, probably just given the physical differences from high school to college. But you're clearly, I think, going to need more from your freshman class in a year-in, year-out basis. And so as this group moves into year 2, I'm very interested in seeing what Kirby Smart has to say about a number of them.
Let me squeeze a quick final one in. I talked about Oscar Delp off the top. A couple times this spring, I've sort of made the case for him being kind of overlooked nationally, partially because maybe didn't have a great season a year ago. Georgia offense didn't have a great season a year ago. I think pretty quietly Delp could sneak up on some people this year and be a really big sort of catalyst for offensive improvement for Georgia. Do you buy that for Oscar Delp right now?
I do. And look, it's a very talented tight end room. I like Lawson Lucky a lot. That guy clearly showed he can do something a year ago. I know there's been a lot of chatter about Elias Williams, Ethan Barber. Jaden Riddell is a very good player as well in that room, and it speaks to what Todd Hartley has been able to do with this tight end room. And I think maybe that's the tentpole that you would like to see Georgia model throughout the rest of its roster. But when it comes to Oscar Delp, I appreciate his candor, which he spoke last week, talking about how there were at times he had one foot out the door. I saw enough to at least question, was there something there with him and Carson Beck where they weren't really on the same page for whatever reason that might be? And at the same point in time, late in the season, something clearly clicked for Oscar. He had the 2 touchdowns against Tennessee. I thought he had a huge performance there against Texas in the SEC championship game, especially late where Gunnar Stockton felt comfortable going to him. Before Gunner's big run, Oscar had a big third down conversion where he's dragging Texas defenders to get over the line. So I think going into this next season, look, Gunnar and Oscar are as close as any 2 players are on this team. I'm very interested in seeing how he continues to develop. And he's a guy who, I got a chance to talk with him in the locker room after that Notre Dame game. The way that season ended, and I think the way the 2024 season as a whole went, clearly weighed on Oscar. And I think a big reason he came back was because of how last year in particular went. Because Oscar Delp, if he wanted to be, I think he'd be in this year's NFL draft. I think he would be a top-tier tight end prospect. I know there are production concerns, but he has all the tools that I think an NFL team would savor. And so I think with Oscar going into this year, how does he continue to build as a leader, and what does the connection look like with him and Gunnar Stockton?
I think it's really good stuff. Connor, great to have you here. I'm looking forward to your coverage from Athens later on today for Georgia spring practice. And, of course, we'll have you back here on DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro again very soon, too.
Yep, as always, it's a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I think really good stuff. Really interesting there from Connor Riley. And, one of the names he mentions, Jaden Riddell. If you talk to people who are kind of, as I like to say, know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, that was a guy who got a lot of buzz in kind of the pre-spring practice time of year, for whether it be like the workout stuff or like the individual, just individual stuff that, pass catching they were choosing to do. A lot of people really like what he brings to the table. And, honestly, we've lauded Todd Hartley for years. We'll continue to do so because the sheer talent in that room is really remarkable. So much so that, Elias Williams just getting off the bus is going to be one of the more, shocking, figures you'll see just because of the size, the height. Barbour, I think, has a chance to be a real player. I think he was one of the more overlooked members of the 2025 class. And then a guy who has been in college now for a little bit, a guy like Riddell getting the chatter he's getting, and I think it's a fun group. It really is. But I do believe that Oscar Delp has a chance to lead the way there on that. Speaking of leading the way, when it comes to a cruise vacation, Royal Caribbean leading the way, setting a brand new standard with each and every introduction. In 2025, another one of those years of so much new to be celebrated when it comes to Royal Caribbean. Obviously, for our DawgNation cruise coming up in a couple of weeks, we're going to be on the newest Royal Caribbean cruise ship of them all for right now. That's Utopia of the Seas. But the mantle of newest Royal Caribbean cruise ship will only last for just a little bit longer for Utopia, because shortly after that, we got this summer the debut of Star of the Seas. That's going to be the second in the Icon class of cruise ships. And I'm excited about Star of the Seas as much as anything because I kind of consider Port Canaveral to be my home port. That's the easiest port for me to get to. I like a drivable port. That's why I like Utopia of the Seas. Well, Star of the Seas is also going to be right there at Port Canaveral, too. So if you live like me here in Georgia, if Port Canaveral's the easiest port for you to get to, probably is, how about a brand new Icon class of ship like Star of the Seas debuting this summer? Jessica Slater's a great travel agent. She can tell you all about it. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. So we talked yesterday about something at CBS Sports looking at, hey, these are surprise teams that could be in the playoff here this year. ESPN kind of had its own version of that recently, looking at teams that just across all of college football who sort of have a chance to be kind of like what the SMU or the Arizona State would have been a year ago, the sort of surprise team that has dramatic improvement, and a couple of SEC teams show up in that. I want to focus on three of these just for a moment. I want to talk about Alabama, LSU, and Texas A&M. Let me start with Texas A&M. And that I really do believe that if you kind of poll the sort of happiness level of any team in the SEC, I think you can make a case that Texas A&M fans are the least happy of any fans in the SEC right now. They did not want Texas in the SEC. They tried to warn all of us it'd be a miserable experience. I've had a lot of fun back and forth with some A&M fans who've come to me and say, I try to tell you how bad Texas would be. They didn't want Texas in the SEC. Longhorns are here. They've been in the Final Four now 2 years in a row. And Texas A&M, even in transitioning from Jimbo to Mike Elko, hasn't been kind of able to break out of that sort of 8-4 type ceiling for the program. They had Texas finally in their own building a year ago in the renewal of that rivalry, had a chance to win it. They lost the game. I think that the situation in College Station right now is really interesting. I believe that Elko's a really good coach. I believe that's a pretty deflated fan base, even more so than teams that seemingly on paper have less going on. They perhaps believe there's more hope, more reason for optimism. The worst thing for you sometimes is not when your team isn't winning, but it's when your rival is winning. And the success of Texas, I think, puts Aggie in a little bit of a weird spot here right now. Let me also mention LSU. We have kind of gotten this one wrong for a couple of years. So maybe LSU really is on the verge of being far improved compared to its past. But we made a big push for them to be in the playoff in 2023. Got that one completely wrong. So we're going to be a little slower to kind of buy the dip here on LSU, I guess, if you want to say it that way. However, I will say this. One of the things I believe is oftentimes true is whatever the contrarian opinion, it's worth paying attention to. And the world is very down on Brian Kelly right now. Notre Dame seems to be better without him. He didn't win much with Jaden Daniels. Daniels looks like the class of the rookie quarterbacks in this past year in the NFL. All of that sort of seems like, sort of dark marks on the resume for Brian Kelly. But sometimes when you sort of at least expect it, that's when public opinion proves to be wrong. And perhaps Kelly's been kind of out a little too fast. This is the one thing that does come to my mind about that. Also on the Alabama front, I'll just say this real quickly. We'll get Jake Fromm. I think this is the year this becomes Kalen DeBoer's team. Last year you sort of inherit the sort of program strength that Nick Saban put in place, but now kind of moving forward, your own offensive coordinator and things like that, we're about to judge, Kalen DeBoer on his own merits and not just the institutional memory left over from the Nick Saban era at Alabama. Could be kind of an interesting evaluation to take place. And we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, let's keep the Georgia football conversation going. Welcoming the great former Georgia quarterback, Jake Fromm. Always happy to have him on the show. Jake, we appreciate your time. Thrilled to have you here. And if you don't mind, let me keep same conversation going we have been having. I sort of started the show today by saying, I think right now Oscar Delp is a little bit of an overlooked guy for Georgia. Now, sometimes the overlooked thing doesn't fully come to, shape the way that it could. But when you think about the level of focus he seems to be displaying in some of his interviews right now, the overall talent level that's in place, his decision to return, I think this can end up being a big deal for Georgia here this year, maybe even more so than some people kind of outside the program perhaps realize. What's your overall take on Oscar Delp? How much you've been able to watch him, and what do you think he could do for Gunnar Stockton, kind of moving into Stockton's, we presume, first full year as the starting quarterback?
Yeah, I think whenever you look at big-time years and careers of quarterbacks, there always seems to be a go-to tight end kind of body in the mix there. So having Oscar elevate to a different level this year, the level of focus that he's bringing this spring, could really prove to be huge for Gunnar. And really excited from what I'm hearing about Oscar. I think he's focused and he's ready to roll. And just really honestly hearing a lot of good things from him.
That's awesome to hear. One of the things I believe is true is that he and Gunnar have lived together, and I guess Drew Bobo maybe in the mix with him there on that. How important is stuff like that? Because, I know when you play, I guess Charlie Warner would have been sort of your guy like that. I know you had others there too. A lot of us most of us have not played major college sports, but we have played on teams. We make friends with our teammates. That bond that sort of comes from being a roommate and sort of having that extra connection, that's something that Delp mentioned in particular when he spoke to the media last week. As someone who's been through that kind of thing, how valuable do those connections end up being?
Yeah, there's a level of comfort and familiarity there. Just a guy that you trust that's going to be in the right place at the right time. You can feel body language a little bit better for whatever reason. I guess it's just, seeing them too much throughout the day. But you definitely develop a different kind of relationship when you live with someone and you do life with somebody. And man, that can really prove to be very, very helpful and beneficial for both those guys and the team moving this fall.
I can imagine that's also kind of an interesting sort of, I guess, growth moment for you as a player too, because this is probably your first time. I mean, it is your first time living away from home, and you're kind of, to a certain degree, got to be responsible for your own stuff a little bit. I would imagine when you're 18, 19, kind of going through some of this kind of stuff, the experience of actually living at a place away from your parents for the first time, that's almost as, whatever the word is, challenging as some of the football stuff, probably, right?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. Man, there's a lot of growing up that happens, between 18 and 21 years old at college. And man, who your roommate is I think a big indicator of kind of how that change and that shift and how smooth that transition is. So man, being able to have good, mature roommates with a good head on their shoulders, I think is everything, man. Glad that my roommate was Charlie, and a couple other of my buddies, really good influences, and man, it helped keep me straight, keep me in line. And I know Gunnar and Oscar are sharpening each other as well to do the same.
You mentioned, kind of having that tight end to throw to kind of turn this around and put it on the Gunnar Stockton side here for a moment. How important is for a new starting quarterback, a guy getting acclimated, you kind of think of him as like security blankets, whether it's tight end, wide receiver, whatever else. How important is it for a guy like Gunnar Stockton to sort of fully establish, hey, here's who I know I can throw to when things get hard? This is what like Brock Bowers always was. It's like, it's like if something gets tricky, Bowers is there somewhere. Let me just throw it to him. Like, how important is it for Gunnar Stockton to sort of find his own version of the easy button of if pass pressure's coming, if the crowd's loud, I always know I can throw it to this guy? How important is that for a quarterback to establish?
Look, I mean, that's huge. It's a get out of jail free card. If you get man-to-man coverage, hey man, I know this guy is going to win on his route. And being able to have that guy, that matchup, that winner is huge. And it really makes your job a lot easier as quarterback. Gets you from thinking less to just worrying about executing and throwing a good ball. So man, that is a really, really big deal. And who that guy is and who will it emerge as, I have no idea. I mean, you always kind of have a feel, during the spring and during camp, but man, really until them lights come on in those first couple games, do you really get an idea of, man, who's going to be the go-to guy for me and somebody that I can always count on.
I want to ask you coming up about what it is you look at when you look at quarterbacks. But prior to that, let me remind folks, it's our Kroger Fresh Take with Jake Fromm here today on DawgNation Daily. We always love the chance to sort of pick Jake's brain and kind of find out what he thinks about whatever's happening when it comes to the world of college football, Georgia football, everything else. And all of this made possible by our friends at Kroger. And my invitation to you as we're kind of rolling into the spring, you got a lot going on. You probably want as much time and money to enjoy those things. The great membership model from Kroger gives you a chance to have way more of that. It's called the Kroger Boost. You can go to Kroger.com/boost, try it for free for 30 days, learn more about it. Free grocery delivery, free pickup as a member. Also on the stuff you're already buying at your local Kroger, how about twice the fuel points on those things? That is what Kroger Boost is all about. It's worth giving it a try here today. So find out more online, Kroger.com/boost for that. Kroger.com/boost for more on that. So, Jake, one of the things we've learned in the last 24 hours is Jared Curtis, a five-star quarterback from Tennessee, is going to announce on May 5th whether it's Georgia or Oregon for him. I won't necessarily ask you about Curtis in particular because my guess is maybe you haven't seen a ton of him. But I am sort of curious, though, as a guy who plays quarterback, played quarterback, a guy who's just kind of in that world. If you're looking at sort of the next big thing at quarterback, for those of us trying to make sense of what a Curtis is or what other quarterbacks might be, what would you look at? What would matter to you if you go online or something like that and you're trying to acquaint yourself with somebody that hasn't played in college yet but has got all the accolades? What would stand out to you and matter to you if you were measuring a quarterback?
Yeah, I think obviously there has to be some level of physical talent. Do you have the tools? Can you make the throws? Is there a quickness, a little bit of speed involved there? What is the athleticism like? That's like the first bar and the first level, the first hurdle that you have to overcome. And man, then I'm really kind of diving into kind of what you're like in your head. What's your mental headspace? Are you a competitive person? Do you love ball? Are you a good processor? Can you see the field? Can you anticipate things? So really trying to dive into that, that second bar, that second hurdle, to really get a good and genuine makeup of what they're like. And man, it's really tough to see all these kind of intangibles and all the other things that you can't really measure, right? And that's what makes recruiting and all this so hard. And but man, that's really what I would be looking for, and trying to get the best guy that I could to come and play quarterback at my program.
In this day and age, it's also as unpleasant sometimes as it is to think about how you're going to handle the money. The same way that, you would see this with the first-round draft pick of, how's this money going to change you for the good or not? You kind of have to do that, some of that kind of stuff right now too, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what kind of goals do they have? What kind of aspirations, are they going to just show up and think that they made it and they're good and they're satisfied, or are there bigger goals in mind? Do you want to be a starter? Do you want to be, to be a quarterback of a championship team? Do you want to be an All-American? Do you want to go to the NFL? So there's so many different things that go into that, and making sure you as a coach and recruiter are asking the right questions to get a good idea and make up and what kind of guy and what kind of kid you're getting, man. And it's kind of weird calling them kids because they're not kids anymore, man. Sure. They are young men, and man, they are asked to do grown up things and young men things, and man, they are given a lot early. And what they do with that, I think is huge.
All right, so we'll say goodbye to you. Last couple of weeks, we've seen you've been hanging out at home, kind of chilling. Today, you got your Detroit Lions gear back on. Looks like you're back out training again. Jake, best of luck with all of that. There you go. He's at the facility. There you go. You're getting some serious work in right there. I'd love to see that.
That's right.
At the what appears to be the House of Pain. That's good stuff. Jake, thanks for your time. I appreciate you being on the show. Really do just value your insight. So thank you very much indeed.
Hey, thank you for having me, Brennan. Always enjoy you.
Good stuff there from Jake Fromm, checking in from the Georgia Indoor Facility. Got his Lions gear on, doing some work. That's what you want to. You want to have people you're connected to that are that connected to Georgia. So that's good stuff there from Jake Fromm, and a great way to close it out here on a Tuesday. Let me also give a shout out here to our friends at Zagoria Law, by the way, the official dog bite injury lawyers to the Georgia Bulldogs. Somebody you love, been bitten by a dog, perhaps you have, or just injured by a dog. You deserve the chance to fight for the proper compensation on that, to get right, just properly taken care of if the owner of that dog hasn't done everything it could to take care of the pet, of the animal. Well, that's what our friends at Zagoria Law want to fight for you on. You can give them a call, 833-GA-DOG-BITE. That's dog spelled D-O-G, 833-GA-DOG-BITE, or online, ZagoriaLaw.com, Z-A-G-O-R-I-A, ZagoriaLaw.com for more on that today. We love having them a part of DawgNation Daily. We also love our golden shoes here, too. How about our buddy Jermaine King enjoying that 3-game sweep for the Dogs at the hand of the lousy, stinking Gators? Says, I took a break from watching basketball to check in on the Georgia baseball score. Says, I saw this beautiful score and thought of you. Hashtag Go Dogs. We appreciate Jermaine on that. Yeah, Georgia dominant over Florida, winning 3, really blowout fashion Saturday and Sunday. We say keep them coming for the Diamond Dogs, and Jermaine King, good golden shoe submissions like that. We say keep those coming as well. And speaking of those lousy, stinking Gators, we told you yesterday they are down bad. Lost to Georgia in basketball, and I don't care what they do in the tournament. You're not going to erase the head-to-head loss. Blown out, swept in baseball, and how about 1,599 days since Florida's beaten Georgia in football? You love all of that. That is our Gator Hater Updater. You'll have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We will look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs, showing up on time, doing the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on that. So I said this before our show began. We have a thing we have to do today. We don't do a ton of meetings, thankfully, but we do have a meeting we have to attend today. That means we got to get off the air. So let me take a couple of comments. I mean, literally like a couple, and then we're going to bounce out of here for today. Frederick Meredith talking about some Georgia receivers: Noah Thomas, Colby Young, Dylan Bell, Zachariah Branch, considered vertical threats. I think all those guys in their own way have a chance to have very good years for Georgia. I think that how Dylan Bell will be used this year is going to be interesting. You talk to people closer to the program, and one of the things you hear is perhaps a little bit more in line to kind of be that sort of creative, kind of Swiss Army knife type weapon. Perhaps that's in line for Bell, and for someone like Colby Young, obviously the big body guy, but he's also shown some ability to get behind the defense a little bit too. I think that's a valuable weapon for Georgia. Look, Georgia needs a big upgrade at wide receiver, and you've at least got enough names that I think give you a chance to provide that. I really do. Alan Hampton says he also believes that Kirby Smart and company did one of their best coaching jobs last year with a staff as good as any in the business. So there you go. Pretty strong endorsement coming there on that from Alan. Let me pop over and get a couple DawgNation.com comments. As I said before, we'll try to do more comments tomorrow, but we're going to have to go for today here in a minute. Busy day for us around here. At DawgNation.com. Let's see what else. DT critical of me, just goes to show no good deed goes unpunished. Let's see what else. Garrison Tucker says UGA fans forget about Isaac Nauta. Nauta was always one of those guys that was incredibly valuable in like the we call them like 2-minute drill situations. Like for whatever reason, that Georgia offense and like Nauta's last year in 2019 would sort of come alive sometimes during the 2-minute drill, and just a lot of times Nauta would be at his best. Seems like in moments kind of like that. Seems like there was a lot of that from him. Let us see what else. Bill Camacho said, I didn't want my Sooners in the SEC, but unfortunately they are. Yeah, I think a lot of folks had to make peace with that. I don't know that anyone's been asked to make more peace than what A&M's been asked to make. Randy Hall says he's excited for some new talent here in 2025. No doubt about that. SEM Dog says, I think one of the most underrated stories from last season was how much we missed Cedric Von Granger at center. Yeah, I think that's probably true too. And we always sort of knew that Jared Wilson was going to be the darling of the pre-draft process because as a center, he's going to be one of the best athletes that's ever tested at the center position. You know, certainly on the high end of that. Very, very athletic, great straight line speed, for instance. And, you know, Wilson was really one of the more praised athletes for Georgia during last year's spring practice. This is one of the guys that was kind of getting the most buzz during spring practice a year ago. There were a lot of people who thought that Wilson was going to be every bit as good as SVP had been for Georgia. I think the honest truth is that just didn't turn out to be the case. And I don't mean that critically. And the honest truth is I can't even point to you and say this is why he wasn't as good. But there are people who know more about football than I do, and they've told me that. So I'm going to take their word for it, that perhaps that didn't turn out to quite be the year from him that it certainly could have been. A couple of Facebook comments. Gary Holt and the sub Billy Cloud talking about the Georgia schedule. Yeah, a lot of the tough road games this year kind of flip and become home games. And to a degree, that perhaps makes it a little bit easier, but it's still a road game at Tennessee. Still going to be a road game at Auburn. I really think that one of the talking points we may get into, you know, you subtract Clemson off the schedule, for instance, but I think one of the talking points we may get into is what's supposed to be a far easier schedule this year actually turns out not to be quite as easy as it could have. And that's, to me, when the SEC kept punting, kind of kicking the can down the road on a permanent scheduling model, this is the problem you create. For a team like Texas that had a remarkably easy schedule a year ago, well, now they get that 2 years in a row. And for a team like Georgia that sort of had a remarkably tough schedule, at least theoretically, now you kind of get a version of that 2 years in a row too. Whereas if you're doing something that's really a little more organized, then the schedule balance should sort of stabilize year to year, because in these very large conferences, even if you play 9 conference games, there are going to be some teams that just play easier schedules than other, and that is going to have an impact on who makes the college football playoff. It just will. There have been hackers on the Facebook page. I'm sorry about that. I am sorry about that. Thank you to Neil for telling me that, but I am sorry. All right, we got to go for now, y'all. We'll try to do more comments tomorrow, as I said before. We don't have a lot of meetings around here, but we do have one today, so we got to take care of some business on that. Y'all have a great day. Check out RS Andrews online for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust RS Andrews on all that today. Hope you have a great day. Back tomorrow, DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro. We'll talk to you then.